let you each introduce yourself, just basically
Okay.
who you are and where you're from,
Okay.
and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending the session on nuclear security. My name is Ron Nixon. I'm a vice president. Very long title, so I'll just leave it at vice president at the Associated Press. And I'm going to let my old panelists introduce themselves. However, I will just say happy anniversary to Jace here, our panelist. So, a round of applause.
My wife's not super excited that I'm not home, but here we are.
So we'll send a shout out to her.
Yes.
Okay. So let's start over here to my very right.
Hi, my name is Bill Hennigan. I'm a national security writer for New York Times Opinion.
I'm Jason Rezaian. I'm a opinions columnist at the Washington Post, and previously I was our Tehran bureau chief.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Rasha Aridi. I'm a producer for Science Friday, which is a public radio show, a science show based in the U.S.
Okay, so we're gonna, I don't know how old some of you guys are, but I remember as a kid that they used to have these drills because they thought that the Soviet Union, for those of you, the Soviet Union used to be like this big, ginormous country that's full of all these various countries that you now know, like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all of those places. But we would have these drills where we would have to get under our desk and then cover our heads. And these were like constant. It was because of the threat of nuclear war. Now, I have no idea why they thought that was going to protect us from a nuclear weapon, but hey, we did it. But it was like a fact of life then. And there was always this threat that the Soviet Union was going to launch, either we were going to launch, and especially when Ronald Reagan became president, that we were going to launch weapons against them, or they were going to launch weapons against us. And, you know, it's in popular culture, like Prince had a song called Ronnie Talk to Russia. It was like everywhere. The movies all had like, you know, nuclear holocaust. And so it was just everywhere. And then nothing. It's kind of like disappeared. You've had movies here and there, like The Peacemaker with George Clooney and Nicole Kidman, about like terrorists stealing like making a dirty bomb, right? But the large threats of nuclear attacks and use of nuclear weapons in war largely faded from the public consciousness and from pop culture. So we're going to talk about today is like why it is still a threat and why we should, as reporters, cover this topic. So I am going to actually start Rasha here about, you know, most of us don't have like this as a beat, right? So why should we cover this?
Yeah, great question. So this is not my beat, unlike Will and Jason. I'm pretty new to this. I started reporting on nuclear issues about a year ago. I never thought I would end up doing this. I was honestly too scared to touch the topic. There was too much science and history and politics and ethics and social justice that I was honestly just too scared to touch it, but I found my way in. I'm a science reporter. And so I looked back at the history of science. I've kind of looked at how, you know, radioactive like nuclear fallout has ended up in like tortoise shells and like wild boar, and how it persists in our environment, how it's still making people sick. And so I think whatever your beat is, you can find a way in. Don't let this topic overwhelm you. So I'm a science reporter. I came at it from a science angle. If you cover health, there's so much to do there. Environment, also finances. If you're a financial reporter, there is a ton of money involved in this. So you just kind of have to find your way in, because there really is an angle for everybody. And I think if all of us across every beat covered this topic just a little bit more, I think people would be more informed and have a more holistic view of kind of all of the angles instead of kind of being overwhelmed by the geopolitics of it.
Thank you. So, Bill, let's go to you. Like, you've just started a series about the threat of nuclear weapons and why there's even more of a threat today than ever. Well, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think, as you've said at the top, this issue has kind of faded away from the consciousness of the public, and I think in large part because it was replaced by terrorism, the fear of after 9/11, and that kind of became the boogeyman in a lot of people's minds. But all the while, the nuclear threat remained. And while we had the United States had détente with the Soviet Union and later Russia and forged these various agreements over the many years, which put guardrails on the threat, over time this has faded away. Now we're left with only one existing treaty between the United States and Russia, and that's been suspended. Basically, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really exist. We do not know how many warheads Russia has. We trust that they only have 1,500 deployed, and we ourselves say we have 1,500 deployed, but we don't know because there's no verification systems in place any longer. And so it not only is it suspended, but it's going to sunset in 2 years. Throw in China's massive buildup. Now you have a three-body problem. So this sort of strategic balance that was maintained between the two great powers now has a third party, which has there's been no arms control with China at all. And then you have various actors like Iran, and which has developed a nascent capability to build the bomb should they decide to go cross that threshold. And North Korea, which I think if anybody really understood the North Korean arsenal, it's far beyond anything that we ever anticipated. They have ICBMs that can reach the United States. They have tactical nuclear weapons that are aimed at South Korea, and they can touch any of the bases in the region. So it's a very, very volatile situation that we find ourselves in. And I think our main concern at the times is that there's just not enough conversation about this. We're not pressuring our lawmakers and politicians to forge new agreements because we've left it to the professionals to handle this, right? But they're not handling it, and so we wanted to apply a little extra pressure there.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bill. Now, you mentioned Iran, so Jason, I'm going to bring you in here because obviously Iran is back in the news again, right, with the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza, and their attack on Israel. What? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I thought I was pretty loud. So, but let's talk a little bit about Iran, right? And can you just give people a little bit about your backstory for those of you who may not know your history with Iran?
So I am Iranian American. My father was from Iran. My mom's American. I started traveling to Iran as a freelance journalist in my 20s. I moved there to pursue a full-time career in journalism in 2009. Was hired by the Washington Post as our correspondent and bureau chief in 2012, right as the nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers were really starting to get somewhere. And as they were entering into a new phase in 2014, my wife and I, who's also a journalist, were arrested in our home and taken hostage. And ultimately, I became sort of a piece of leverage in those negotiations. I was released in 2016 on the day that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal between Iran and world powers, was implemented. So I like to say that, as far as I'm concerned, that nuclear deal was kind of a wash. It got me arrested and it got me freed. But there was 18 months in between. But I've been watching this situation very closely for a long time. And the nuclear component is obviously a very important one for the reasons that Bill mentioned. We can lull ourselves into thinking that the U.S. China and Russia are responsible actors that can figure it out. I don't think anybody in the room would say that North Korea falls in that category. And I think if Iran were to make that decision to proliferate, it would also set off an arms race in the Gulf. Turkey would probably want one. Saudi, Emirates, maybe Egypt. And I don't think that's a world that any of us want to live in.
So I think some people I know, like, I don't have a full grasp of, like, how many nuclear powers are there actually around the globe?
There are not 9 nuclear powers.
Okay.
Israel is not a declared nuclear power, but
Right.
they have nuclear weapons as well.
Okay. And let's go back to you talking about, covering this as a beat, even if you're not a journalist who covered it. Say, someone give me, where are some of you guys from? Okay. Other than San Francisco, right? Okay. Nothing wrong with San Francisco, but someone give me a country. Country.
Not America, not Italy.
Right.
Anybody?
Anybody?
Come on.
Nobody wants to, say where you're from? Like, really?
Germany.
Germany.
All right.
Okay. Let's
Cool,
say you're
okay.
reporting in Germany, right? And this is, again, not something that you typically cover. Like, what's the entry point into, covering, the threat of nuclear weapons and non-proliferation?
Yeah, good question. So for me, closer. So for me, I've started, I've come at this pretty new. I've started just trying to keep an eye on people's reporting is a good place to start, right? See what's going out there, follow reporters like Bill and Jason. But also, I think what really helped me was going back in history, looking for, what happened 25 years ago, 50 years ago, these big anniversaries to find news pegs that I could tie my reporting to. So for example, the 80th anniversary of the Trinity test and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are next year. That's already on my calendar. I know I'm doing a story for that. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is in the US to compensate people affected by nuclear testing, that's set to expire in July, and it'll probably get extended, but that's also on my calendar. So I've started just by kind of planning out all of the stories I'm going to do, finding those time pegs, and starting now with sourcing. I'm really lucky. I have experts that I've spoken to for hours on end who will sit down with me, talk for an hour and a half, pull up a whole slideshow and be like, here's what you need to know. And I take that information, I cross-check it with other people, I fact-check it myself, but to find people who can explain it to me in human terms that I can understand, because if I can understand it and make sense of it and critique it, that means I can do the same for my audience. So I've started building those relationships with people. It's really helpful to find them within your own country, to be able to go to universities, think tanks, research institutes, and start building those relationships now, because there's also a lot of trust involved in this, especially when you're talking to victims of nuclear testing, like downwinders in New Mexico affected by fallout from the Trinity test, or survivors or descendants of survivors from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. There's a lot of trust involved, and you need to start building those relationships over time. You can't call them, 2 days before your story is meant to go and be like, hey, give me a quote, because that's not going to fly, right? I've spent hours kind of building those relationships, and so if you're nervous of where to start, I say call up your local university, see who they've got on tap, go out for coffee, sit down with them, and try and build those relationships, because the more you can make sense of it in your own mind, that's only going to help build your reporting out.
Back to Bill here. Given the ongoing conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of saber rattling, particularly from Russia, about potentially using tactical nukes. Right? In your reporting, does anyone think that's actually a possibility? And then the second part of that question is what would that look like if Russia were to do that? What would that look? What do they think that would look like? I again, want to just ask as from your reporting.
Yes,
of this.
of course,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. It's a needle that needs to be threaded.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say with Germany and Poland, they're both interesting cases because they've both been talking about adding a nuclear weapon to their country, right? There's been open conversation in Poland about basing NATO nukes there, and Germany talking about a Euro deterrent. We're trending in a bad direction. After years of continual reductions, we're now talking about more nuclear states and more nuclear weapons. Anyway, sorry. With the tactical nuclear weapon issue, there's a paradox in the Ukraine conflict, which is that if Russia is doing well, there's less of a chance that a nuclear weapon will be used. If Russia is not doing well, then there's bigger fears that they will reach for a bomb to regain the upper hand in the conflict. I reported in our first story about the fall of 22, when there were deep fear, when Ukraine was on the march and clawing back territory from Russia. And there was deep fears about Russia using a nuclear weapon to stop that advance. Should Kharkiv fall, Kharkiv and Kherson there was the big fear, and then they would turn to Crimea, which they've illegally annexed in 2014. And the intel assessment in the United States was 50-50 on whether or not they would use a nuclear weapon. A coin flip. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy put the chances of a nuclear weapon being used at 1 in 3, famously. And I also describe what a tactical nuclear weapon would be. Now, I should just kind of say what a tactical nuclear weapon is. What we know nuclear weapons are H-bombs, these city-destroying hydrogen bombs. What a tactical nuclear weapon is basically a Hiroshima-sized bomb. Or it could be lower. Hiroshima was 20 kilotons. The Russians have tactical nuclear weapons that are sub-kiloton. They have ones, twos, but also like half of a kiloton. But half of a kiloton is 50 times larger than the largest conventional weapon in the U.S. arsenal. And so we think of these things as like, oh, well, it's a tactical nuke. It's a smaller nuke. Beyond the explosive power of such a weapon, there's these domino effects. I mean, crossing the nuclear threshold for the first time in 80 years will cause massive disruption. People will, they'll be fearing a tit-for-tat escalation between the United States and Russia. And so people will run for the borders. There will be deep concerns, particularly in Ukraine, which is known to be a European breadbasket. Any exports out of Ukraine will be seen with deep fear about, passing radiation on. And yeah, I mean, just like 9/11, you'd figure that there would be a pause on flights, all the sorts of things. And so when we talk about nuclear use, and we're world leaders are increasingly becoming normalized to wield the nuclear saber. We're not taking all of these ripple effects into account. It's concerning.
So let's go back to Iran because of their recent attacks on Israel. The AP, we did a story early on about Iran building a facility like really deep underground that would potentially shield it from the largest bunker that the U.S. has. And Israel was, we interviewed them. They were like, yeah, it doesn't matter. We'll still figure it out. But does this, and again, just based on the reporting or sources that you may have talked to, does this potentially escalate to the point where Israel's like, this gives us the opportunity now to go and actually bomb that facility?
I think they might use it for that, and I think they'll probably try and make that case if they feel the need. But I think in terms of Iranian strategy towards all this, I'd take a slightly kind of counterintuitive approach to it. I think that they recognize, for those reasons that I mentioned earlier, that the actual having of a bomb for the Islamic Republic is probably more of a headache than a big benefit for them. That's, I think,
Really?
yeah, and I think if you go back to 2003, when they made this sort of grand offer to the United States to stop their program, we know that until 2003 they had a weapons development program. We don't know that they've ever started it up again in that way. I think they recognize quite well that fake intelligence got rid of their long-term neighbor next door,
Right.
and they didn't want to suffer the same kind of fate. So I think a lot of times the Iranian threat, and if you take one thing away from what I have to say, is that it's oftentimes more bark than bite. I don't think they have the capabilities to back up some of the things that they say that they'll do, and I think we're seeing that playing out right now.
And I think that they've also used their nuclear latency, the fact that they're on the cusp.
Yeah, that helps.
It helps them. They've been able to extract benefit from teasing whether or not they're willing to cross it.
For over a decade.
Right,
I mean, it's
right.
pretty impressive.
So, and let me just, to a reason that we don't often talk about, the sort of triangle. Pakistan, India, and China are all nuclear powers, and they're all right in the same area there. And they're not particularly cozy towards each other. Is there any sense from like the national security community that, given some of the volatility in that area, that could be a potential powder keg, or has it not, from particularly some of the things we've seen in Pakistan in the past, but has that moment kind of passed, or is that still like an ongoing concern?
Yeah, it's a weird relationship because Pakistan, their nuclear arsenal is based off India's. India's is based off China's, and China's is based off the United States. So you have this weird, deterrence in that, nuclear deterrence is kind of it's very difficult in that area of the world. And I think, because China's been described as like an eye-watering proliferation, because China forever had a relatively small nuclear arsenal. And now they have about 500 bombs, which is, compared to the United States and Russia, that's about a 10-to-1. But they're going to have 1,000 by decade's end, if you believe U.S. intelligence, which is an important number because the United States and Russia they have 1,500 weapons deployed. So I think that China's proliferation, China's growth of their arsenal is going to have all sorts of effects in that region, because all of these actors are going to want to respond, particularly India, which again, it's a sort of self-licking ice cream cone, where it just causes a worse and worse case.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm really interested about that sort of scale,
Right.
right? Does it, when you get to those kind of numbers, does it even matter?
No,
Right.
it doesn't matter. I mean, that's
It's
a
just a
funny.
psychological
Yeah, it's a funny. That's why I've always found nuclear issues interesting, because it's like a game. It's like a card game. I mean, often I read a lot of Cold War stuff, and it was described as poker.
Right.
It's like a poker game, and I find that sort of gamesmanship very interesting. And I was about to cuss there, but like the screwed up part about it is that all of us are at risk because of the game.
Yeah.
And again, we leave this issue to a nuclear priesthood, a group of people who are self-interested, so on and so forth. But all of us are the targets of these weapons. And I don't think that we wield enough our voices. We don't speak enough about this. You were talking about at the top about this sort of the movies and the songs and everything like that, the culture. It was in the zeitgeist.
Right.
In 1982, there was 1 million people in Central Park in New York City calling for the governments of the USSR. You were there. The USSR and the United States to freeze their nuclear arsenals into place. Can you imagine anything close to that? I mean, I don't even know what issue would motivate 1 million people to but it's certainly not nuclear weapons.
Right, yeah. Not
Yeah,
today.
Taylor Swift, right. But that's the sort of, that changes things.
Right.
When people are that invested, it changes things.
So one of the other things that we haven't really touched on here is, and anybody can address this, is the age of some of these weapons. Right? Like I've seen like some documentaries, or I think 60 Minutes had a thing. Like a lot of these, they're using like floppy disks. So young people, floppy disk are like, God, how do you even describe a floppy disk anymore, right? So they're using, and not just like the little floppy disk,
No,
but
the old
the
school
big
ones.
old school floppy
Yeah.
disk for equipment that's not even manufactured anymore. So what is the danger simply because of the age of these weapons? And, open it for anybody to discuss.
Well, I've been in those, I've been in the silos that you're describing. And they're like that seafoam green that your grandmother had, with the air refrigerators and the appliances, like really old. And the companies on there, like Hughes Aircraft Company, they went defunct like decades ago. There's all of it's just, and then the screens themselves of like the computer screens that they work on are trichromatic. Like you remember in grade school, right? But so the age of them, the big concern for me is that they're going to want to replace everything, right? They're wanting to replace all of that stuff. So we're going to have a whole new generation. Okay, we've lived 80 years in the atomic age. We're building new systems. That means we're going to live 100 more years. We're handing this to our children. Our children are now going to have the problem, 100 more years of nuclear weapons. I think that there are always concerns, of course, about these weapons breaking down, and the parts, because I covered the Air Force. The parts that go into these systems are now antiquated, and so they're no longer made. Not only do the companies that made them don't exist anymore, the stockpile of these parts no longer exist. So they have to be machined from scratch, and they're exorbitantly expensive because they're all bespoke. So it costs the taxpayer more money. But
given that, do we know if these things will even work?
yeah, I think we do, because every quarter or so what they do is they pull them out of the Midwest in the Great Plains states, and then they blow them off in California to make sure that they work. So I think that they'll work. I don't know if we want them to work.
Right. Well, I mean, I wasn't advocating that they would work, but just the question there. But then, point that you made that they want to replace them. But then if you're replacing them, you have to dismantle the existing ones, which then what do we do with that material, right? Which then creates health risk and other risk, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, a couple months ago, had author Sarah Scholes, who reported a book on this called Countdown. It's excellent. Check it out. But she basically kind of walked through like what the U.S. is doing, and I'm speaking specifically for the U.S. It's about $2 trillion over the next 30 years to kind of replace and update our 80-year-old nuclear weapons. The idea is like you wouldn't
Trillion
park
with a T.
Trillion, yes,
$1 trillion.
TR-illion. And so the idea is like you wouldn't park your car in the garage, leave it there for 80 years, and expect it to drive later. And our idea of nuclear deterrence, of this idea that if I have nukes and Ron has nukes, then like neither of us are gonna go at it, because like then we're both destroyed, right? It's this idea of mutually assured destruction. And so for deterrence to hold up, we need to, the world needs to think that our nukes work. And so that's the thinking behind that. Scientists, our weapons are about 80 years old. Scientists have said that the plutonium on the inside, which makes the core of the bomb, is probably safe and stable for like 100, 150 years maybe. Some people argue less, but by starting to update that arsenal, it's going to require, plutonium mining, which is, polluted the environment horribly the last time the US did it, and cost so much money and effort over decades for a weapon that we hopefully will never use. And so the idea is like, why would you update them if you never want to use them? And so it's kind of has everybody on edge. The science is debatable, and the application of the science is debatable. Like, why are you doing this if you don't ever want to use the weapons? But, it holds up the idea of deterrence. Don't bomb us.
Let me stay with you on that, because we at the AP and others have written about, in the past, the Air Force was saying that the workers, like airmen and folks who worked on these weapons, they weren't impacted by it. But now we know that they were. Do we know anything about workers in other countries, though, being impacted by these weapons health-wise?
Yeah, great question. So, sorry, far away from the mic. Great question. So I will say, like, most of my research and reporting has been based in the US, but I can say there's a very colonial component to nuclear testing. Sorry for the boom. For nuclear testing specifically, the US government has tested pretty much exclusively on indigenous land, dumped waste into Cherokee Nation, tested on Shoshone Nation, and Cherokee, bombed the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, which led to nuclear fallout affecting people in Guam. The British tested in Australia, France, and Algeria. Nobody wants to test on their own land. So on top of like having to mine for these weapons and pollute the environment, you're also going to, if testing is going to resume, hopefully not, like, so many more people are at risk. Like, indigenous people have been disproportionately affected by the production. Sorry, as a radio reporter, that freaked me out. By the testing and production, and so we are still seeing the effects of people, the health effects of people who, worked in uranium mines in all across like the Southwest and Great Plains in the U.S., whose generations have been poisoned, whose land and air and water and wildlife are still poisoned. There are people who have been, one source that I've gone to several times is the fifth generation in our family to have cancer because of the Trinity test, Oppenheimer's bomb. And so we're still seeing the health effects now, and by kind of resuming having to manufacture plutonium pits, we're putting another generation further at risk, and not just their generation, but all the generations after them as well. So it's really, it's going to affect more people than we think, and I think in the US at least, we're still trying to unravel all of those and trying to get the government or people are trying to get the government to compensate accordingly, but I think everybody in this room straight up has been affected. Like, if you go outside and rip up a plant, that handful of soil is absolutely going to have plutonium in it. That's nuclear fallout. We are all affected. It is everywhere, and of course some people more than others, but all of our health and livelihoods are at risk, not just the actual deployment of the bomb, but with making it.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. We're going to actually open it up for questions now. Wanted to save a little bit of time, or actually more than a little bit of time for questions. So there's a microphone back there. There's a question up front here.
Okay, thanks for the great panel. I wanted to ask Jason, the challenges of reporting on the Iranian nuclear program. Can you contrast what it was like being inside Iran and trying to report on the program versus being on the outside now? Is it harder? Is it easier?
Not very easy to report on the program from inside, although there were occasions where they let a handful of reporters in. I was never one of the foreign reporters that was invited in, made many requests. But I think when you go into these facilities, there's not that much you can glean from it. You know, you're being led around. You're not allowed to have your phone. Can't take pictures. They provide images to you afterwards. I don't think that, you know, that's an aspect of reporting on Iran that requires being there in some of the ways that everything else I reported on Iran did and still does. But what I would say, kind of going back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier, I think how we frame this conversation about Iran and its quest for a nuclear weapon is really important. I mean, I think, you know, there was so much talk about the JCPOA being such a bad deal, and, you know, why did the Obama administration get into it? Well, you know, by our own intelligence assessments and the Israeli ones and everybody else, it was working to do the thing that it did. And I, for one, think to...
Get you out?
That was the first thing. That was the first thing, right? And then, you know, after that, though, you have to realize, okay, there's zero guardrails on Iran at this point. And going back to what Rasha was talking about, and what Bill was talking about, I mean, I think we want to keep this nuclear club at 9, right? For all of those reasons that she was just mentioning. If more and more countries have this capability, the likelihood of us not having another nuclear disaster plummets. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. Yeah.
Other questions? Question up here?
Hi, thank you for the great panel. You compared the nuclear situation with a poker game, and there are points to be made that it can be of that you exaggerate or downplay your nuclear capabilities. Are there different strategies in different countries to play that game?
Countries that have nuclear weapons or do not?
Both.
Well, I guess it's both. It's good to cover both. I do think that nations have, like Iran, exploit the fact that they could go nuclear but haven't made that decision yet. Japan is another nation that has enough. They have enough fissile material to build a bomb should they decide to do. Should they have the political decision making to do that. The Korea has the technological wherewithal to build, and they use that all the time to that latency. It's called nuclear latency to extract benefits from allied nations as well as their adversaries. You know, they use that as a the threat. But nuclear, yeah, of course. I mean, we're seeing that at play in Ukraine right now. You know, with Russia. Russia's using their nuclear weapon to, you know, the criticism of the Biden administration up until recently, where the Congress won't fund weapons to Ukraine. The criticism of the Biden administration for the longest time was that they are paralyzed of fear of the nuclear threat, and Russia uses that to their advantage constantly. I mean, you know, every other day you turn on the TV and Putin's on there making one thinly veiled threat or another. You know, you don't see that too much out of China, particularly yet. But I do feel as though that their very public buildup is a you know, sending some messaging on Taiwan, on the Taiwan issue. So, but yes, absolutely. I mean, it works for both nuclear powers as well as those who have the capability but haven't crossed that threshold yet.
Okay.
Hey everyone.
Okay, it can't be everybody from this row, right? Like, okay, like somebody. Okay, all right. So.
Hey, thank you so much for this great panel. First of all, I'm a journalist working on nuclear issues, and I worked extensively on French Polynesia testing for 2 years. So I'm happy to see a panel here at Perugia of people working on the same topic as I do. My question for you guys and everyone on this panel is, one of the key concern and key problem we had reporting on that was secrecy, right? I mean, we know that the classification mechanism was contemporaneous to actually the Manhattan Project. So how do you guys tackle this issue and reporting on, and being confident to report on those issues, not only based on national security sources, and be able to do an independent assessment of what being said?
There's a organization called the National Security Archive. They do really great work getting older documents and having them declassified. But yeah, I mean, it's a constant issue. I mean, even those nations that were subjected to testing don't have all the facts of what happened to them. I get really angry about that. Because I mean, it's an awful thing that these people were subjected to this, and yet they don't deserve the answers to what it boggles your mind. But I think that there's a number of organizations that do a good job from the outside of collating data on nuclear arsenals. You'd love to have more of it. The U.S. Has to tell us about how much they pour into the NNSA and just what it takes to maintain these weapons. So there's a wealth of data around, but it's certainly not enough, particularly when you're talking about the history of these things, which would give us a better understanding of our present.
And just the National Security Archives is based at George Washington University in the U.S. Okay. Did one of you guys want to take a stab at that?
I was just say yes. Is this still on?
Yeah. Still on.
Oh, okay. I couldn't hear myself. I think a lot of this data is still very shrouded. For example, I've spoken with downwinders in New Mexico affected by fallout from the Trinity test. They don't have data to back up what they say, which is part of the problem. Is the U.S. isn't going to admit to, polluting their air and land and water, and also keep funding Los Alamos National Lab down the street. And so a lot of this data is really hard to get access to. I'm certainly not an investigative reporter. For me, the most important thing is going to primary sources, to people affected by this, to downwinders, to people in Japan who have kind of lived with this legacy, and building on what they have to say, because ultimately they are the very first and hopefully the last victims of nuclear fallout, that they should be central to every story if you're going to report on it.
So what Rasha's talking about, these people, they were told that they were not affected for the longest time. And this older woman, who's like anybody's grandmother, they were like, okay, well, we don't have any data on this. We didn't do any, government doesn't do studies on these people for specific reason because they don't want to see the results, right? Well, this woman, she remembered that there were a bunch of deaths of babies around this time. And what she did, but the problem was that the babies were, they were born and they died very soon after they were born, and but so there was no death certificate because the baby only lived a day or whatever. So what she did, because it's a Catholic area, she went to the churches and got the baptism because the babies were baptized. This was the sort of data that she had to do this ground reporting by herself to get the numbers of babies that were born and later died. So these babies were born, but they have no record of them living past their baptism. And so this is on the people to come up with, to explain, to convey to a wider audience of what they've been victimized of.
Yes, exactly. They have felt helpless, or not helpless, marginalized, ignored, trying to demand attention, resources, money from the government to do this. That's not happening. They've taken it upon themselves. So, yeah, I think it's super important to tap into those local networks, because this woman, Tina Cordova, she is, she has dragged physicians over and environmental scientists. She's like, here's the problem. Here's what we've seen in our community. Please study it. And studies and research have been coming out of that. So if you can, build relationships, earn trust with people on the ground who have experienced this and lived this, there is so much data and anecdotes within communities that, our government obviously won't.
And this did end well, though, because for the longest time, the RECA that she was talking about, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provides $100,000 for people who've developed a certain type of cancer, if they were in the fallout zone, that government decided where the fallout zone was. New Mexico was not on that state list. They were never included. So it was almost like an iron wall. If you lived in the neighboring states, you'd get compensation, but the New Mexicans did not. Despite all that, and anyway, they've been in the latest bill. New Mexico for the first time has been added to get repaid. But $100,000 for anybody who's has to endure chemotherapy is a pittance for the treatment.
Okay, we probably got time for one more question.
I think during the Cold War there was there were a number of incidents that we really just skated by luck or a recognition by a relatively low-level officer to make the right decision. That sort of thing, that's no way to live. So it's kind of amazing that we've had, the only incident that I can think of is there are various incidents of weapons being dropped in Spain, for instance, and
South Carolina.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but in Arkansas was with fire. Command and Control is a terrific book. I recommend that. But I have a big concern about. I think that the more weapons there are, the bigger chance that there are that they might be used, either by mistake, mishap, or madness. A world leader that's unhinged. But I do feel like the good news about this technology is that it has gotten safer. Now, I just read something about artificial intelligence being used in decision making because it shortens the response time. Because that's the big thing with nuclear weapons, right? Because you can go across the globe, on one side of the globe to the other in 30 minutes. Your decision time is probably around 7 minutes, 15 to 7 minutes, to respond if you wanted to do that before they land. So they want to do artificial intelligence in these to make it automatic, to shorten that decision space. And I think that that's deeply concerning, and that's something that we're going to have to look at in the future. It's going to have to get hammered out between the world powers on how we're going to infuse AI with these weapons. Okay.
Thank you,
so
Bill.
that's my fear for the future.
Thank you, Bill. So with that, we're gonna end the panel. But let me say first of all, thanks for the Outrider Foundation and Rob for sponsoring the panel, and give a hand to my fellow panelists here, Rasha, Jason, Bill. Thank you guys so much. Great panel. And